Hello, listeners. Welcome to Homegrown KC, a podcast dedicated to exploring Kansas City's fascinating history and sharing stories from its past. I'm your host, Laura. Today, I'm with Andrew from the Johnson County Museum once again, and we're going to discuss their newest temporary exhibit, Away from Home, the American Indian Boarding School Stories. So, this is a nationally organized exhibit. It's not one put on by the museum. How did it get to be here?
Yeah, great question. So this exhibit was originally a permanent installation at the Heard Museum in Phoenix, Arizona, which is a pretty well-respected history museum. And they updated an exhibit that they had that was very similar to this and created a traveling show at the same time, working with the Mid-America Arts Alliance, which is an organization that creates and tours humanities and art-based exhibits, actually here in Kansas City in the Crossroads district. So they worked together to create this exhibit, make something that was a traveling version of it that would come in 20 crates straight to your door with a 400-page instruction manual on how to put that together. So they worked on this and put it together. They had funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities. They also have funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Chickasaw Nation to continue traveling this exhibit. So I'm not sure when it started to travel. We signed the contract for it in 2019.
Oh, wow.
And I went to orientation for the exhibit when it was freshly created, I think, before it even started traveling. So it must have been 2020.
I'm guessing
January
that the
2020.
difference in time here is because of COVID.
Yeah. Well, so we sign contracts that far out, actually, for traveling shows. It's usually 3 to 5 years in the future. So this is exactly 3 years for us from when we signed the contract and oriented on the exhibit. So it's a really great show. I think the exhibit is really well done. I love that it has so many indigenous voices in it, telling their own story, which is something that you don't see in a lot of museums or in a lot of textbooks or history books. So I think it's a really special thing about the exhibit.
We'll come back and tell our listeners more about the details of the exhibit, but I agree. I think the videos listening to the native voices were my favorite part. Yeah. Do you know where it's going next?
I think it's going to Los Angeles, and it came from El Paso, Texas.
Okay.
So it goes all over the place. They tour these shows for like 5 years or more, I think, when they do them.
Okay,
so
cool.
It hits a pretty good number of places. We have a pretty short run, so it's actually it's 6 weeks the way it fell for us when it arrived. You have a certain amount of time to build the show and then have it on display and then tear it down before it travels to the next place by contract. So we got 20 crates delivered to us, and in
from your
3.5
voice, you sound like you just had so much fun putting that together.
It's like a big IKEA set, basically. And not everything for each element of that exhibit is in the same crate. It's kind of grouped by size and by type and things. So
that's not helpful.
Yeah, no. So it takes an immense amount of organizational skill. Our collections manager, Liz Lumpkin, was instrumental in getting this thing put together in such a quick rate for us, and she'd already analyzed where everything was and sort of organized the room for us as we unpacked. So it's a major undertaking, and then to know in 6 weeks it has to come down, right, and just do the reverse, put everything away in those crates. It's a lot of work, but it's worth it. It's a really well done exhibit. So.
Yeah, definitely for this one. So can you give us a brief history for anyone who doesn't know? Because I'm pretty sure I didn't learn about this history until college.
Yeah.
What's the American Indian Boarding School?
Yeah. So it is, we can think of it as a retraining facility for Native youth. They come out of the 1870s, and this is the era of war on the Great Plains, right? And you probably learned it in school as the Indian Wars, right, on the plains. And so the federal government is fighting indigenous nations across the Great Plains. When the federal government wins those battles, those indigenous groups are then usually put on reservations in areas and moved off of the Great Plains as the Transcontinental Railroad is going across, as homesteading is starting to happen, as the bison are being, decimated by people moving westward to California and Oregon. And so there's a lot of things happening in the middle of the country, right, that was sort of reserved as Indian territory. And so in 1879, a military officer named Richard Henry Pratt was running a POW camp, prisoner of war camp, for Native warriors who were captured in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And he started to introduce English language, Christian religion, change their hair and dress, very militaristic style at that facility. And as he's doing this with, full-grown adult prisoner of war, he was like, this would be a really helpful idea for retraining Native youth. Euro-Americanizing them, essentially. Supposedly, the Department of War had done calculations. It was something like $1 million, for every Native warrior that's fighting on the plains, right? But it would only be $1,200 a year to cover the costs for Native youth to be re-educated at an Indian boarding school. And so Pratt then turns Carlisle into the first Indian boarding school in 1879. And so in the exhibit, you'll see a barber chair with a braid and a pair of scissors. When Native youth arrive at these schools, their hair is cut, their clothes are changed into Victorian, in that era, in Victorian clothing. They get a new name, they get a new religion. They're taught in classrooms with desks that are in rows. Very different. Excuse me, sorry, my cough dropped. Very different from Native learning styles. And Native culture. And so this is an attempt to fully immerse in Euro-American culture, right? Western culture and learning. And you've probably heard the quote, and I don't know if it's a true quote or if it's sort of a paraphrasing, but kill the Indian to save the man. And that's the mindset of the time. Remove all the indigeneity from these Native youth and turn them into essentially Euro-American copies, right? By teaching them things like handicrafts and manual labor and trades where they can earn a living and support themselves, and also create something or do some work that is beneficial in Euro-American society. That's the goal of these schools. And so they run from 1879 into the 1960s, even the 1980s. And then we see some changes in them, and we can get back to that later a little bit. There's some really interesting things that happen. But I think one of the key things to think about is these are called off-reservation federal Indian boarding schools. So off-reservation means you're not at home. You're somewhere else in the country, right? And so as a student going there, you may or may not have somebody else who speaks your original language, in your classes.
Not that you were allowed to speak their language.
Not that you were allowed to speak your language. In fact, you would be punished if you did. That's part of the immersion, right? It's losing your language, learning a whole new language. But you're far away from home. You're at these boarding schools often year round or for semesters and things. You may or may not be able to get home over the summers. Your family may or may not be able to visit you. You're often divided up by boy and girl dorms, by ages and things. So you may or may not have your siblings with you if you went to school with siblings. And so it's a very isolating thing for students. And a historian has said something to the effect of, this is something that's happening on such a public level, right? You're at a school, there's lots of other students, there's administrators, there are people in towns who are coming and watching what's happening at these schools. And yet there's such a personal dimension to the whole thing because you've lost your identity, right? You've lost your clothing, your jewelry, your culture and traditions, your name. There's a quote down in the exhibit that says, they changed all these things about me. I even got a new name. Mine turned out to be Fred. Like, what a matter-of-fact quote. And yet what a intensely personal thing. That's your identity, your name, And so it was really just one more example of Kansas as a contested space, right? Because there was a school in Kansas, Haskell, Indian Nations University today. It was called Haskell Manual Labor School, something to that effect, industrial labor school at the time. Started in 1884, so pretty quickly after Richard Henry Pratt started this in 1879.
And there were how many total?
That's a good question.
40?
Yeah, something around that number. I know by 1900 there were 25 of them, so they formed pretty quickly. And at their peak, in the Great Depression, there are like 60 or 70,000 students at these schools. Conditions weren't always great, of course, and what's happening there is not great. But for many Indigenous parents, there was at least the guarantee of food and shelter in the Great Depression when much of the country is looking for work and, having financial difficulty. And then that on Native reservations it even amplifies those issues in the Great Depression.
So being that this is specifically off reservation, were there on reservation federal schools? Or just
when they were
on
first set up, I don't
reservation
believe so.
missionary schools?
There are today on reservation schools. The important thing I think to recognize for this area is that there were on reservation mission schools, which you just mentioned. So the site in Fairway, the Shawnee Indian Mission State Historic Site, as we call it today. At the time, it was the Shawnee Methodist Mission Indian Labor School. That's not exactly right. I get caught up in the names, but it's a private school, right? It was a school that was set up by the Methodist missionaries. It was religiously affiliated and run. It was on the Shawnee Reservation from 1830 roughly to the 1860s roughly. And so it was a precursor to this federal system. It's similar in a lot of ways, a lot of this very similar history happening at these schools and similar conditions, and yet it's a totally separate thing from the federal school. So when we think of that site in Fairway, that's not a federal off-reservation school. That was on reservation. And that really matters because students who went there were generally closer to their parents, so they might go home on weekends. They might have their parents come visit. That would be possible. They're on a reservation, and so there's community around them. The thing about Shawnee Indian Mission, there were 20 other cultures, 20 other indigenous cultures that sent students there too. It wasn't just the Shawnee, but those reservations were all right within this area. There were also a Quaker mission in Johnson County and a Baptist mission in Johnson County that were all on the Shawnee Reservation. So, this is an earlier era, still receiving some federal funding, but a different thing than this federal system that develops across the country. And is this system that develops across the country, interesting to think about this, it's originally developed by the Department of War. Right.
Yeah,
we're talking about education as a type of warfare, right? Retraining Native youth, and eventually becomes part of the Bureau of Indian Education. But when is that starts,
separate from the Bureau of Indian Affairs?
I think it's part of that. Yeah, okay. I believe it's part of that. So anyway, it's interesting those differences, and you can locally, you can find out more about the Shawnee Indian Mission by going to that site, by checking them out online. And also for Haskell, you can find out more about them online, the school there. And there's also an exhibit at the Watkins Museum right now about student life at Haskell. So you can check that out. So I think it's called From Then to Now, A Student History of Haskell Indian Nations University. So
nice.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about specifically the exhibit. I would say the first half is this dark history that we've been referencing and what is typically known of the system.
Yeah.
But then the second half, maybe even the last quarter, talks more about the recent history, the 60s and 70s, and how totally different it was. That was actually really surprising to me. But there wasn't as much that I saw about the change in between. Like, how did it change?
Yeah, so it starts to change actually during the Great Depression. In the 20s and 30s, we start to see some schools have indigenous art teachers, indigenous sports coaches and things. And so there starts to be some indigenous culture, right, coming into education, coming into the curriculum.
Very slowly.
Right? Yeah, exactly. There are sports organizations that are set up where athletes, can take pride in what they're achieving individually or as teams. Haskell had a world-class football team. Jim Thorpe as an individual athlete was incredible, right?
They had a little bit about him that was really cool. I didn't know that he ballroom danced.
Yeah, I know. He did everything, man. It was pretty impressive. And so we start to see some of this native culture and native learning coming back into these schools, right? Or coming in really for the first time into these schools. That leads to then some more changes. And so by the time we get to the 60s especially, they talk about it as Indianization or self-determination, creating clubs and newspapers and things where you can be critical of the education you're receiving at the place you're receiving it. Indian clubs, as they were called, sharing your culture and your traditions with other Indigenous youth, other Indigenous students, because you're coming probably often from cultures who may not have ever had contact before, right? Mm-hmm. From different areas of the country. So there's a lot of things to learn about your past too, right? And share that with other students. And so this is when you start to really see that change in education in the 60s with the American Indian movement, AIM, right? Civil rights movement. And schools start to actually take pride in the curriculum around that Indianness, as they were calling it at the time, that indigeneity. And so places like Haskell, for example, start to turn a corner, right? They're going from being a boarding school that's run by the federal government to they become first, I think, a junior college and then eventually a university, right? Mm-hmm. That's run by Indigenous professors and administrators that are teaching curriculum that's important to the students and that the students want, not just, what's dictated to them by the federal government. And same for sports programs and art and theater and clubs and things. And so, there's over 1,000 students to go to Haskell, and they're from like 140 different Indigenous nations, which is amazing. Mm-hmm. And we see this across the country. We also see federal Indian boarding schools closing during this time period, not turning that corner, right? From the 60s all the way into the 80s, we see schools closing across the country. We also see other things popping up. So on reservations, community colleges developing, tribally run junior colleges opening. There are other Indigenous universities that were set up across the country, right? So we really start to see that pride in indigeneity and that interest in learning and sharing one's own traditions and learning about other Native traditions at these schools.
Mm-hmm. And then one of the very last things that they had was that there actually are still 4 boarding schools, but they are on reservations and they're run by the reservation.
That's right. That's right.
So was there anything in there that was new to you, a surprise to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware of this history, right, because we're so close to Haskell and learning about some of the precursor history that was the Shawnee Indian Mission and things. But I think just overall, and I know I said this when we spoke last about the system of redlining, just how systematic and intentional it was. Yeah. That's always something that's really interesting to me. I'm very interested in systems and policies and things. And I think we think as humans, things just sort of evolve because we may not feel like we have a direct impact on a lot of things that are happening around us, right? But there are decisions that are made and there are policies that are set and there are systems that are created intentionally. These things don't just happen, mm-hmm. right? And so for this one to go from thinking a prisoner of war camp, retraining these prisoners to then thinking this would work well with Indigenous youth, as students, and then creating that federal system, that took money and work and intent and policy creation and things. And there's a lot that goes into that. And that's American history, right? We're talking about Native Americans, but this is American history. And it's a part of it that, like redlining, is not well known, right? Mm-hmm. As you said, you didn't learn about this until college. I would say the same thing for myself. Definitely didn't learn about this until college. So,
I didn't have any other questions. Is there anything else you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, I think there are some programs coming up. I don't know when the show comes out, but I'll just sort of list them through. So the 23rd, next week, we'll have Eric Anderson, who's a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University. He'll be talking about education for Native youth in Kansas. On March 2nd, we'll have Kim Warren, who's a professor at KU, and she'll be talking about ideas of citizenship and education for Native Americans, but also African Americans, and how those ideas are very different from what we expect of white American youth, right?
Okay.
And then for museum members, so if you're a member of this museum, we'll be offering some tours that we're arranging at Haskell and at the Shawnee Indian Mission. So great time to become a member. One, you get free access to the museum, including Kidscape, if you have littles in your life, and discounts in our store, but also we'll be having these members only events, arranging those. So some really interesting things. And I would also say there are ways to learn more, right? Going to or learning about Shawnee Indian Mission and that earlier history and how that may have played into this federal system. But Haskell, going to the school, seeing the school. They have a cultural center that's not open right now, unfortunately, but there is that exhibit.
Closed for renovation or something?
Closed for lack of funding.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. So, but there is this exhibit at the Watkins Museum in Lawrence. It was put together working with students and professors at Haskell, so it was a partnership. From then to now, a student history of Haskell Indian Nations University, and that's open beyond the run of our exhibit. This exhibit here closes March 18th, so limited amount of time to come see this exhibit before it goes on to Los Angeles, right? Mm-hmm. And all those greats. So, but I think the last point I'll make is just how special this exhibit is by having so many quotes and oral histories and photographs of Indigenous people telling their story in their own words. That's really something special, and I was really impressed by that when I got a chance to tour this 3 years ago, and I was impressed with it again as I'm setting it up in our own space. So,
Yeah, like I said before, that's the part that I enjoyed the most. So there were a lot of professors who were speaking, and everyone who spoke was like, I attended a boarding school in the 60s or 70s, or my father or grandfather, did back in the 30s and 40s, and just talking about their experiences. And a lot of them were like, no, I had a positive experience. I think those are the more recent ones. But yeah, just the variety of perspectives was really interesting.
Yeah. So two things from what you just said. One, you're absolutely right. We think of this history as being, Victorian era or early in the 20th century. This history is happening through the 60s, through the 80s in some cases, right? Yeah. So there are people who are middle-aged right now who attended a federal Indian boarding school, and are living and working in our communities, right? So this isn't some history that happened over there a long time ago. It happened right here, in this region pretty recently. So that's one. And two, yeah, you're absolutely right. There are so many, I think there are probably as many different perspectives of Indian boarding schools as there were as students who went to them. Yeah, right. Yeah. And some people in all eras had really positive, or remember them as really positive experiences, learning a trade where they could make a living, and be part of American society. And at the same time, there were people who didn't want to have anything to do with that. They were happy living with their families and their communities and their traditional ways and things. Mm-hmm. And this totally changed the trajectory of their life in a way that they didn't want, right? Yeah. And there are things in between and beyond both of those perspectives too. And yes, in the exhibit, you'll get to hear those. And I think that's a really important thing. History is complex, just like us, right? Yes. Our lives right now are complex. And always
good to bring in multiple perspectives so you can see the fuller story.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, that'll be the end of today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, I just wanted to say thank you for supporting me. I appreciate y'all. I hope you will continue to support me. I've got a lot of great stuff coming out the rest of this year. And if you have not already done so, please like, follow, subscribe on all the social media pages. That's Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, Twitter, Tumblr, and YouTube. Don't forget, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or episode suggestions, you can email me here at patreon.com, or you can send me a DM on the social medias, or you can send an email to my Gmail. That's homegrownkcpodcast@gmail.com. Also, check out the website, homegrownkc.wordpress.com. Sign up for my newsletter there. And if you want to get any merchandise, go to zazzle.com/store/homegrown_KC_store. That's zazzle.com/store/homegrown_KC_store. Thank you to my talented sister-in-law, Sarah McCombs, for the creation of my logo, the Dear Misses for the use of their song Kansas City as the intro and outro music of the show, to local libraries which enable me to gather all my research, and to you. Cheers.
Seem to shake this feeling, and I can't seem to get you off my mind.